this axiomatic thinking. It was just, in Truman's mind, this was outrageous and he was going to respond. But that was the start of it. And of course, the bitter war for 3 years ended in 1953 with an armistice, not a peace treaty. And technically, the United States and North Korea are still at war. Now, with 7 decades of enmity, we've wound up with a Korean peninsula in which there's a demilitarized zone in the center, but the demilitarized zone is surrounded by heavily armed forces. At one point, the North Koreans had 100,000 troops within 100 kilometers of the DMZ, and the U.S. 2nd Infantry Division stationed just south of the DMZ, and that's American troops in Korea come to about 28,000. And in visiting the DMZ in the 1980s, I was struck at how undemilitarized it was. And if you looked at the tunnels that the North Koreans had dug under the DMZ, they were clearly planning an invasion of the South. So there was a demilitarized zone which solidified the armistice. And what you do if you're North Koreans, you dig under it. And similarly, when the United States in the 70s was trying to clear some trees in the DMZ so that we could see, our guards could see the actions on the border more clearly, the North Koreans killed a number of American troops that were basically clearing these trees. And there's a long history of actions which are really quite risky. For example, the most recent, I suppose, would be the North Korean actions in 2010, where they sank a South Korean naval ship, the Cheonan, and shelled islands and killed South Korean citizens. And that's an extraordinarily risky action to take. But the North Koreans were prepared to take that kind of risk. So you go back to what I said about where are we in terms of managing a process. There are lots of wild cards here. And we really, even though the North Koreans are not suicidal, they are often risk acceptant. They're willing to take risks that could lead to the miscalculations that I've referred to historically. The current phase of the hostility between the United States and North Korea goes back to 1992 and 3, when the North Koreans violated their safeguards agreement with the International Atomic Energy Agency and began reprocessing plutonium from the Yongbyon reactor. And first they denied it. Indeed, after having separated the plutonium, they tried to cover this up by burying the tanks and planting a forest of trees on top of it. The only trouble is, as you will remember, when we looked at the photographs, we noticed that all these pine trees and fir trees had died in the pattern of the tank underneath it. There was so much radioactivity coming up that even though you planted this forest, you could see the outlines of where the tanks were. So not a very successful cover-up, to say the least. But anyway, that led to the North Koreans essentially withdrawing from the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It led to intense diplomacy between the United States and North Korea, which created the so-called agreed framework. But it didn't stop North Korea's efforts to get the nuclear weapon. It just diverted it somewhat. The result of this is that after nearly 30 years of this latest phase of the hostility, which I would call the nuclear phase, is that there's deep mistrust on both sides. North Korea thinks the United States wants to destroy its regime, and it believes that possession of nuclear weapons is the only way to guarantee its security. And the United States' pressures on denuclearization are, in the North Korean eyes, deceptive. They're ways to take away the one strong card that North Korea has in its hand. So when you say, well, why would you cheat and deceive the Americans on one agreement after another, it's because the whole American approach is basically to deceive us, to think that we'll be treated normally if we don't have nuclear weapons. And the United States cites the many efforts to negotiate where North Korea has violated agreements, such as the original withdrawal from the NPT in '93, or developing enrichment despite the '94 agreed framework, violating the leap year moratorium in '07 and so forth. So mistrust on the American side is that, well, we've tried to negotiate with you and you've constantly violated each agreement we've made. Indeed, with the leap year moratorium, it was violated within days or weeks of the agreement. So deep mistrust on both sides about intentions in this nuclear phase of the hostility. Now, despite United Nations sanctions and alleged condemnation of other countries represented in those sanctions, the North Koreans are continuing their nuclear missile tests. The sixth nuclear test last week, they claimed, was a thermonuclear device. It's a little bit unclear whether it really was what we would call thermonuclear and hydrogen bomb, or whether it's what we would call boosted fission, where you wrap thermonuclear materials around a normal atomic bomb. But the point is, it was about 5 times stronger than their previous devices. And they've announced their goal of miniaturizing the warhead and making it capable of hitting the United States. So their missile tests are getting more and more capable in terms of longer distances, and their miniaturization of a powerful warhead is making progress. And it's possible that in a matter of a few years, they might be able to credibly say that they can strike a significant portion of the U.S. mainland. That's often exaggerated in the press, in which people fail to see that the re-entry vehicle and targeting the re-entry vehicle is an extremely difficult part of this trajectory and arc, and we've seen very little about that. So the fact that we make a missile go up and go a certain number of kilometers or miles is only half the story. But so there's an exaggeration of how imminent the North Korean hitting the mainland of the U.S. is. But it's a clearly stated goal, and they are making progress. And it's plausible that somebody like Sid Hecker, former director of Los Alamos, says that in a few years they'll have that capability. Now, President Trump has said he will not allow that. That's intolerable and unacceptable. So, if true that the North Koreans continue to make progress, and that the President of the United States has said he will not allow it, we are headed for something which could be a crisis or a confrontation, which would raise the kinds of questions that I mentioned from the historical examples cited earlier. So let's turn away from those risks and the escalation and ask, what are the prospects for reconciliation? In other words, suppose we say, is it plausible that we could avoid this impending crisis through a process of reconciliation? And there, when we look to international relations theory, you see that there are over the years, there's been a considerable development in theorizing about this. In the 1950s, Carl Deutsch, our former colleague here at Harvard, developed the idea of what he called a security community. And a security community is a set of countries where there's reliable expectations of no war. And Deutsch argued this evolves out of transactions and interchange and so forth. And he cited Scandinavia. He said, we always think of the Scandinavians as peaceful, but there was a period when the Scandinavians were just the opposite of peaceful. But that over time, you developed a security community in Scandinavia. And of course, the same was true with Western Europe. And this was reinforced by another book of the 1950s by Ernst Haas, Berkeley, called The Uniting of Europe, in which he said that if you add to the change in attitudes that grow out of transactions, institutions, then you can get a situation where war becomes unthinkable. So Germany and France, which have gone to war 3 times in 70 years and torn Europe apart in the process, if we look at Europe today, Europe may have a few problems, but the prospect of a war between Germany and France is not one of them. It's just literally unthinkable. And think of what that means in terms of the nature of international relations. And it's a good example that reconciliation can work. And it makes a huge difference when it does. In the 1980s, there was a revival of Immanuel Kant's democratic peace theory by Michael Doyle, Princeton, Bruce Rust, Yale, and others. And their argument is that historically, there are very few examples of democracies, particularly liberal democracies, going to war with each other. And that if you have democratization and democracy spreads, this can create security communities and make war unthinkable. And for evidence, they might cite the democratization of South Africa or the democratization of Brazil and Argentina in the 80s, which has made war in those cases highly unlikely. On the other hand, the same theory, Kant's democratic peace theory, was popular both with President Clinton and President George W. Bush. And George W. Bush thought that by democratizing Iraq, you could create conditions for peace in the Middle East. That proved to be a severe miscalculation. And part of the reason is that when people talked about democratization and democratic peace theory, they were really talking about liberal democracy, not plebiscitarian or majoritarian democracy. And whatever else was created in Iraq, it wasn't a liberal democracy. And wherever we might think we could get with North Korea in a decade or so, I don't expect it to look like liberal democracy. In 2010, Charles Kupchan at the Council on Foreign Relations wrote a book called How Enemies Become Friends. And he said, if you want to create stable peace, there have to be 3 conditions. One he called institutional restraints, 2nd, compatible social orders, and 3, cultural community. Well, if those are the conditions for stable peace between the United States and North Korea, God help us, because I don't see any of those being accomplished in the next decade or so. Other people have said, well, what about the theories that I developed in the 1990s about soft power and smart power? And it obviously is important to use soft power, but the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payment, which is what soft power consists of, requires that you look attractive in the eyes of the beholder. And so the question is, how much attraction is there in North Korea toward the United States? Well, not much. Kim Jong-il used to like to look at Hollywood movies, but that had no effect on his behavior. And similarly, while it's great to have visits of the New York Philharmonic and others, that didn't have any lasting effect. So in the sense of, is the United States attractive, and would cultural exchanges make the United States attractive in North Korea? I don't think the chances of developing soft power there in the near term are very good either. For one thing, what difference does it make whether a certain portion of the North Korean population sees the U.S. as attractive? It really, in a dictatorship, is irrelevant to the questions of how their government will behave. So unfortunately, I fear that, and I've said this a number of times, that my work on soft power, well, I stand by it for many different areas. I don't think it has a lot to contribute to the situation that we're in between the United States and North Korea. So, if the prospects of reconciliation in the sense of becoming friends is very slight in terms of the near term of decades, what about that second meaning of reconciliation as the reduction of enmity? In other words, if we go from this high threshold of stable expectations of peace and friendship, say that's not likely in the next decade or two, but could we look for that second or lower threshold that I mentioned at the beginning, which is the reduction of enmity? Is that a more promising route to take? And here, there may be more hope. If you go back to this book, Captions, that I mentioned, How Enemies Become Friends, he argues that stable peace breaks out through stages. The first stage is unilateral accommodation. The second is reciprocal restraint. The third is societal integration. And the fourth is new narratives and identities. Now, we're a long way from societal integration or new narratives and identities, but it's possible that you could imagine unilateral accommodation and reciprocal restraint occurring. And the question then we have to ask is there a prospect for that first stage of accommodation and reciprocity in the U.S.-North Korean relationship? Well, what do we learn from history on this? There are historical examples of enemies becoming friends, and without huge periods, of many, many decades. For example, in 1895, the United States and Britain almost came to war over a boundary dispute in South America, the boundary between Venezuela and British Guyana. And yet, within 2 decades, they were allies together in World War I. And the interesting point there is Britain accommodated the U.S. because of the rise of Germany and Russia. It basically was saying we can no longer carry out the foreign policy we had of stability in Europe and stability in the Far East, given the rise of Germany and Russia, and also try to police the Western Hemisphere, where the Americans live. And so the British made a decision to swallow their pride and to basically accommodate the United States. And the United States could be quite outrageous at times. When Teddy Roosevelt, the Venezuelan border dispute was with Grover Cleveland as president, a Democrat. When Teddy Roosevelt became president, there was still a dispute about the boundary between Alaska and Canada. And Roosevelt basically set up a stacked arbitration commission to make sure that we got what we wanted. And the British swallowed hard and went along with it, because it was more important to accommodate the Americans because of these larger questions. Another historical example is the United States and China. The United States and China had fought in Korea in 1950 after China crossed the Yalu when we went up close to the Chinese border. And we went through a period in the 1950s in which we demonized what we called Red China. They were irrational, they were totalitarian, they were a danger to the world, and so forth. Indeed, in 1964, as China was developing its first nuclear test, the United States, under Lyndon Johnson, contemplated a preemptive strike to prevent China developing nuclear weapons. Interesting to ask what U.S.-China relations would look like today if we went forward with that, but that's a side thought. In any case, the Americans basically switched quite dramatically with 1971 and Richard Nixon's visit to China. And the United States accommodated China. It's not as though China changed internally. It accommodated China because it saw this relationship with China as a way to counter growing Soviet military strength. And that opened the door for what has subsequently become a massive economic interdependence between the two countries. Even if that interdependence is sometimes accompanied by skeptical narratives, nonetheless, I think you can make a case that it has reduced the prospect of a war between the United States and China. So that's a second example of accommodation in the sense that I used reconciliation, meaning reduction of enmity. A third, and a somewhat more problematic example, is the United States and the Soviet Union. In the bipolar structure of power and the intense antagonism of the early Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union really had very little positive relationship. And we came very close to a nuclear war in the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. One of the effects, though, of that scare in 1962 was John F. Kennedy realized that this path we were on was a potential path to disaster. And he gave a speech at American University on June 10, 1963, which to me has always been the great speech of his administration. Everybody cites his inaugural address, "Ask not what you can do," and so forth. The really interesting speech was the American University speech in June 63, in which he says, "We cannot continue on the path of extreme hostility with the Soviets that we're on now." The net effect of that was by the end of the year we signed the limited threshold treaty for banning nuclear explosives in the atmosphere. In 1968 we signed a non-proliferation treaty, and in the 70s and 80s we had bilateral treaties, SALT and START, with the Soviet Union. It's not that we liked the Soviet Union or trusted them or had much contact with them. There were very few Soviet students coming to American universities, very little trade between the United States and the Soviet Union, which is very different from China today, for example. But we were intensely aware of the security interdependence, and that led us to a set of agreements which I think didn't solve the nuclear problem, but did at least reduce the temperature. It reduced the degree of enmity. And when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, you really began rapprochement and true reconciliation under Gorbachev and Yeltsin. Unfortunately, and it's a long story that I won't go into today, that was reversed under Putin, and we now have today a situation of considerable hostility. So that was a partial reconciliation in my second sense of reducing enmity, but an imperfect one. So what's the prospect of negotiating with North Korea, of having something where we begin to have at least the Soviet level reduction of enmity, if not the US-British situation before World War I? Well, to assess that properly, we have to be realistic about negotiations. There's always a danger that if you say the first step in this process of reconciliation is accommodation, as Kapshin says, that you can have deceptive accommodation because there's no real reciprocity. And the classic example of this was Chamberlain's appeasement of Hitler at Munich. Now, appeasement is not a bad thing per se. It's a well-accepted technique of international diplomacy. In fact, what the British did with the United States in the 1890s was appeasement, and it worked. So we have taken the concept of appeasement and sort of made it anathema, which is a great mistake, because we apply it just to the case of Munich. And you will find various proposals for trying to get out of our deal with North Korea today are often people who propose them are called appeasers. We should pay no attention to that. There's nothing wrong with appeasement per se. What's wrong is if you appease when you haven't thought through your opponent's objectives. Whether appeasement works or doesn't work depends on your assessment of the opponent's objectives. Henry Kissinger, in trying to assess this in his famous book of the World Restored in the 1950s, was to distinguish between what he called status quo and revisionist states. Status quo states may be rivals, they may be competitors, they may be difficult, but they basically accept the broad parameters of the status quo. Revisionist states are states which want to totally transform the status quo. And if you use the analogy of a poker game, somebody comes into a poker game and says, I want to have more winnings at this table. You know, I want my pot of chips to grow. That's normal behavior. But if somebody comes in and says, this game is stacked, I don't like you people, and I'm going to kick over the table and all the chips are spread all over the floor, that's a revisionist situation. And Kissinger argued that Napoleon was a revisionist. He was not interested in reaching accommodation among the states in Europe in the early 19th century. But after Napoleon was defeated, and you had the Congress of Vienna, they were able to create for some 30 or 40 years what was called the Concert of Europe, in which royalist France was reintegrated into the European balance of power, and there were rough rules of the road of how you managed your enmity. Dick Rosecrans has written very well about this some time ago. Now, the interesting question is, how do we assess the goals of the opponent? Napoleon was clear. He was a revisionist. And when you look at the goals of Hitler or Stalin, I think they were revisionists. And I don't think China today is revisionist in that sense. I think it wants more earnings or winnings at the table, but doesn't want to kick over the table because it's done pretty well at the table. And the question is then, what are the goals of North Korea? Is North Korea, under the Kim regime, a status quo or revisionist country. If it's a revisionist country and we misassessed it the way that Chamberlain misassessed Hitler's objectives at Munich, we're simply laying up greater problems for ourselves in the future. I think most historians looking back would say that the failure of the Western democracies to stand up to Hitler while Hitler was weaker in the 1930s was a great mistake, and it unleashed a decade of genocide and world war. On the other hand, the way we're dealing with China today, which I don't think poses an existential threat to us, is a way in which we can compete, can have strong differences, but in which we see China as having basically not full status quo, but largely accepting the framework of the current order, and that's led to an effective accommodation that I described a bit earlier. Now, if the North Koreans are purely a status quo country, or primarily a status quo country, then if what they really want is security, if they say, I just need these nuclear weapons so you can't overthrow my regime, then you know what? This problem has a pretty easy solution in accommodation, which is to say, leave them alone. Basically sign a peace treaty, relax sanctions, let them grow, and as they grow economically, the nature of their society will change, which is the Chinese argument about how to handle North Korea. And we've got a problem which is relatively easily resolved if we can make the first step of accommodation. However, if they really are revisionist, then that may not be the right answer. And the question there is, given the nature of the regime and the extent to which it is a dynasty, a family dynasty, which has always struck me as an interesting anomaly of 3 generations of a monarchy and a communist country, but leave that aside. But if the dynasty rests upon the ideology of being the heart of the Korean people, and that they represent the future and progress of the Korean people, and they will unify the Korean people in the peninsula, and that mission allows the regime to preserve the ideology and legitimacy that it needs to stay in power domestically, then it's going to be a lot harder to deal with. I thought one of the nicest expressions of this problem was by our Tufts colleague, Sun Young Lee, in his op-ed in the New York Times on the 6th of September, it was earlier this week, and I will quote it. He said, "For the North, menacing the U.S. is a non-negotiable means of isolating and exercising dominance over Seoul. This is how the regime of Kim Jong-un seeks to ensure its long-term survival." In other words, it's not just leaving them alone. If you leave them alone, they're not going to leave South Korea alone, is the way I interpret this. Or another way this is put, it's called the blackmail theory of nuclear objectives. That Kim Jong-un believes that if he can hold a U.S. city at risk, he'll have more room to bully South Korea, and also to bolster the legitimacy of the Kim regime at home. So if that's true, then we have a much harder problem than the problem that I described of it being a security issue with a status quo power. That would have been easy to solve. I tend to think that Sun Lee's view is probably closer to the truth. And if that's true, then we have a really tough problem, and we can't get out of it as easily as I would like. Now, one problem that we have in dealing with this situation is the United States' knowledge and assessment of North Korea is very limited. When Ezra and I were in the government in the 1990s, in the Clinton administration, I think he would agree with me that the widespread view was that the Kim regime would not last more than a decade. And you had a regime which in the 90s was presiding over starvation, which destroyed 10% of its population. And the view that that regime would be able to prosper when you had just across the border to the south, a prospering nation, it seemed very plausible that they were going to be able to last decade. Well, let me tell you, you were wrong. This is why I started by saying, before you pontificate on it, admit your prior mistakes. That was one. I didn't think they would last more than 10 years. And that was the conventional wisdom in the US government in the Clinton period. So we should admit that we often don't know much about North Korea. It's a hard target for intelligence. We don't have a lot of people inside the regime who can tell us what's really on Kim's mind. So it's not like a lot of other intelligence targets where you get readings on various parts of the elite. We don't have very good readings here. And the question then is, if we have had a record of failure, what are the options that we have now? We have a record of American presidents drawing red lines and saying certain North Korean behavior is unacceptable. And we also have a record of Americans consistently accepting what they call unacceptable. Indeed, I've sometimes said that if you were an observer from Mars and you looked down on Earth and you saw the world's only superpower bargaining with one of the smallest, weakest states on Earth, you'd see a poker table where one side had huge piles of chips and the other side had one chip. And you say, now predict which of these two is going to win the game over the next 30 years. You probably would have got it wrong. You might have predicted the superpower. In fact, the North Koreans have outplayed us consistently for 30 years. And I argue in this book I wrote called The Future of Power, that the North Koreans have been brilliant at exploiting what I call the power of weakness. The power of weakness means you don't have many alternatives, and you use that to bluff and to take risks, and it works. You know, the conventional way of putting this is that if you owe the bank $100,000, you're the power of the bank. If you owe the bank $100 million, the bank's in your power. And the North Koreans know that the danger of their collapse or their precipitating something is such that they can play the power of weakness, which gives them much greater ability to take risk and to bluff. So where does that leave us in conclusion? Basically, our current options are very limited. I've already mentioned I don't see much prospect of the use of force. Sometimes people say, yes, but that's going to get worse. We can't wait and let them have a nuclear capability. Well, you know what? We were already deterred in 1994 by their conventional capabilities. North Korea has enough artillery tubes in the demilitarized zone to destroy Seoul 35 miles away. And when we contemplated in 94 the prospects of a strike to destroy the Yongbyon facilities, basically the South Korean government and the Japanese government said, no, this will essentially lead to devastation, which we find unacceptable. So and that was conventional deterrence well before they had a nuclear capability. That hasn't changed. You've just added another level to it. So I'm not impressed by the option of force. Similarly, we use sanctions, and the sanctions have been of some effect in preventing some materials going into North Korea and having some effect on their marginal behavior, but not at the core issue. There's no way that the sanctions are going to squeeze the North Koreans to the point where they give up what Kim Jong-un sees as his hold card, his key asset, which is his nuclear program. If you're willing to see 10% of your population starve, you're willing to tighten the belt quite strongly before you give up your nuclear weapons. The third major option is what I call China diplomacy, which is we'll get the Chinese to solve the problem for us. And this was what the Trump administration seemed to place its major emphasis on. And when Trump met with Xi Jinping at Mar-a-Lago in February, he allegedly said we'd go soft on trade sanctions against China if they would take care of the North Korean problem. Trump came away from that thinking he struck a great bargain. If he knew how much the North Koreans disliked the Chinese and vice versa, and he knew that China was far more afraid of chaos on its borders than it was of a North Korean nuclear weapon, he realized he really hadn't struck a bargain. So where does that leave us? Let me give you my package at the end. And as I warned you at the beginning, it's not very impressive. It doesn't solve the problem. But I think what I could say for it is better than what's on the table now. And these ideas are a combination of ideas that have been put forward by Henry Kissinger, Bob Einhorn, who is at the Brookings Institution, used to handle proliferation in the State Department. And frankly, I used to talk to Steve Bosworth, the late, great Steve Bosworth, about this before he unfortunately died. And you might consider this a China-centric, phased approach with gradual reduction of tensions over a longer period of time. Thus, you don't demand denuclearization right away. And so it would take the shape of something like the following. The U.S. would assure China of our limited goals and agree to closely coordinate our actions with Beijing. China would use its economic pressure and diplomacy to freeze the immediate threat posed by North Korean tests. In other words, instead of allowing them to continually improve the quality of their missilery and nuclear miniaturization, China would use its leverage for that purpose. Not denuclearization, just preventing this from escalating the threat in the next couple of years. Third, the U.S. would gradually relax some sanctions, and we would accept broadly China's theory that the long-run solution on North Korea is their integration, not their exclusion from the world economy. Fourth, the U.S. would offer to negotiate a peace treaty with North Korea, and that would involve accepting the de facto nuclear status of North Korea, but we would state that our long-term objective was a nuclear-free Korean peninsula, and we would get the Chinese to join us in that. Fifth, North Korea would agree to no tests, missile or nuclear, no further exports of nuclear materials or knowledge, and a gradual détente or easing of relations with South Korea. No more sinkings of ships or shellings of islands and so forth. And sixth, and this is a very important part of the package, the U.S. would retain its deterrent and defense capabilities, including our alliances with South Korea and Japan. In other words, this would not be a wishful thinking approach. We'd say, here are 5 things that are major changes, but we're not giving up the capacity to deter if the North Koreans don't live up to this. So to conclude, I would say that this approach is not a panacea. Essentially, what we would wind up doing is agreeing with China to make penalties, self-executing if North Korea cheats or breaks the agreements. But it would be based on taking a longer time horizon and trying to use contacts to induce change in North Korea while maintaining deterrence in the shorter run. So this would be the answer to the Sun Jin-Lee problem, which is if the North Koreans are still revisionist, we haven't given up our ability to deter or respond, but we are at the same time putting on the table something which could open up prospects of accommodation and the prospects that that could lead by a phased reduction over a decade toward some lesser degree of enmity and therefore a lesser degree of danger than we now face if we just let events take their course and North Koreans improve their missiles and nuclear weapons, and Trump says this is unacceptable. So that argument is not necessarily going to produce reconciliation. I think it would reduce enmity and reduce danger. But to promise you that it's going to solve the problem or produce reconciliation would be to violate what I warned you about at the beginning, which I have been wrong on this in the past, and I may be wrong again. I think the major argument in favor of what I proposed this morning is that the current policy that the United States has followed has failed for 30 years, and it's hard to do much worse than that. So could we take some risks in a phased way to try to get some reconciliation in the sense of reduction of enmity? I think yes. And I think I proposed a way to do this. I don't think the administration is likely to follow it. So let me end there. Good.